right, well, we'll get started here. Just want to thank everybody for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn webinar on how to navigate building planning and permitting, understanding how to get your doors open if you are in this process. And I just want to thank Passumpsic Bank, who has been a sponsor of today's meeting, and introduce you to our speakers, panelists today. I've got from North Country Council, I'm going to brutalize Tavares.
Good enough. Tavares. It's a tricky
Tavares.
one.
Oh my God. Thank you. I won't forget. Planning Director, North Country Council. And then we have from the City of Berlin, Pamela LaFlamme, Director of Strategic Initiatives, as well as a couple other hats she wears. Then we have from the town of Lancaster, Robin Irving, who's our land use coordinator at the town, and also has other hats that she wears. And we'll get started. And I will ask that as we go along, if you have any questions, as we go through some slides, feel free to put the questions in the chat. We will also kind of have a Q&A section, as well as the panel will be opening up opportunities for discussion on particular sections as we go along. So at this point, I am going to figure out how to get started. All right, Kayla, take it away.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. And Erica, thanks for making this opportunity for us to all come together. It's a great time to sort of come together and bring planning people to business people and say, where do we sort of come together? This is kind of a bit of a kickoff slide. And Pam, I don't know if you wanted to tag team this with me or if you wanted to take it.
Well, you can just make an opening and then I'll jump in.
Okay, perfect. So the starting point here is really around what do you need to figure out when you're starting with planning and zoning, right? And what we would say here is there's a bunch of different people, right, in your community who do planning and zoning, be them your boards, staff members at your town hall, right, like Robin and Pam are here. And there's also a whole bunch of rules that get posted in your town, your zoning ordinances and other things like that. There's also neighbors who come into play. So right here is just kind of a kickoff slide for us to make the points on where things start, right? And so at the end of the day, when you're starting to do planning for your business or you're trying to figure out expanding or changing something in a location, these are some of the things you start needing to think about.
And with that, I will jump in. Thank you so much, Kayla, for opening it up. And it's funny, as I was just sitting here reading over my notes, and it is a thoughtful guide in preparation and assistance. And kind of my motto has been like the way to get to yes, in that this doesn't have to be a process that, you know, people often think of planning and zoning, permitting as like an adversarial kind of process, or, you know, it's difficult to do these kinds of things in your community. But honestly, I mean, most communities, and that's been the experience here in Berlin, and I know with Robin in Lancaster, we want people to open their business and to kind of make the progress that they want to make within the rules and regulations that communities have set up. And so first and foremost, what really I've learned over time, someone coming in to talk to their project or talk about their project with staff early on is really the best path to success. Like really understanding what it is that is being asked of an individual, a business, small business owners, especially, because you guys are coming in with a lot of hats as well. And, you know, you're a one-person show sometimes you have a little bit of a bigger business, and taking the time to kind of learn the process or the path forward can be daunting. And so that's why we're here to kind of help guide you through that process. And when people come in and appear in front of the board, and I just realized I'm being graded too, because I see one of my board members is on the Zoom here. So I can't say anything that's not true. But I like to bring to the board projects that are ready for the most part, like, or it's very early and it's a chance for our board to give feedback. And so individuals understand what our board focuses on and finds important and thinks is something that an individual might need to bring back further information about. So there's really no set path for every community, because each community has like a little bit of a different way in which they handle things. But if you're in a community that has staff to work with, that staff is really a great place to start, because we can kind of judge by what it is you want to do, how complicated your project might be, what level of support you might need coming in to the process, which boards you may need to see or may not need to see in some cases. I also see one of our local business owners here on the Zoom as well. And his is a good example of he had a great business idea in a local building that had already been used for the same thing that he wanted to do. So he had very little interface with our local boards, but he had a lot of interface with permitting. And, you know, we were able to kind of navigate what that looked like for their business. So there's just a little bit of a different way everywhere, but usually the goal is from the staff, from the community, from the board, hopefully, that they want to work with you and get you to yes, and get you to help you open your business in whatever community it is you're working in. And so with that, we can get into a little bit of some more detailed slides and situations.
Awesome. Erica, do you want to flip us to the next slide if you'd be so
Yep.
kind?
There you go.
So knowing this process, and Robin will speak to it for Lancaster, so you'll get two different examples, one of a city, one of a town, and kind of understanding the different examples of what needs to go through the process is usually kind of the big thing. So coming in and meeting with staff first, and as an example, I'll use, you have decided you want to open a restaurant, and you decided you wanted to do it in a building that's not been used for a restaurant before. So this is you using a commercial space, but with a different use that likely needs some review from the planning board. So I usually invite people to come in and understand where they are in their process, what they've done so far, who they might have reached out to. Maybe they come in with plans, maybe they don't know they need plans. And so that's really a step one. But if the project is a complex one, or one that might be controversial, or may have a lot of moving pieces or parts to it, I invite them to come meet with the planning board to talk with them about preliminary consult. So that's them coming in, like I said, and pitching their idea to the board, and the board getting to ask questions, and the applicant getting to ask questions of the board in return. And that whole process is meant to happen in a way that doesn't bind either side. So, you know, if they come in and say, I want to open a restaurant, but ultimately decide that they want to just do something like that ends up being a less complex than a restaurant. It ends up just being they're going to open a small store with no food service. That's fine, like, because basically that first step in preliminary consultation is just coming in and getting a sense of what the values are of the board, what the regulations are of the board, and they'll let you know early on if they have any red flags they are sensing, or like, no, this sounds like this is in line with our thinking, with our master plan, with our rules and regulations. Usually someone will leave that meeting knowing that they can come back to the next meeting with whatever information they need, and they're ready to kind of go. Pre-planning meetings is usually with staff. And again, it depends on the complexity of what it is you want to do. Usually when you're going into a space that's already been used for retail or commercial, it's not often that you need to come in unless it's a pretty complete change of use or a much more intensive use than was being done in the space prior. If you're taking a building, at least in Berlin, that was residential and turning it commercial, that usually requires the planning board's input as well. And something that's brand new construction always requires coming in front of the planning board. And so you kind of hop through the process of getting, and we try really hard, and Tom, who's on our board, who's on this call, will attest to, we try really hard to cut down the amount of time you spend in front of the board. So as much homework as we can kind of do with staff behind the scenes and get you to the board in a place where they feel comfortable and confident that they have the information they need is really kind of been our process over the years. And kind of the biggest thing to understand is that the planning board is made up of your peers who live in the same community. Sometimes you're coming and doing something from outside, but they're residents of the community. And so they literally are there with their best interests of the community as well. So wanting to kind of see a community evolve and develop in a positive forward way is usually where their heads are at and usually what they're trying to support. Things like a public hearing, those are required by state law. So we do these things in a way in which we try really hard to not make anyone feel uncomfortable. It's a process in which if there are any neighbors or community members who have questions, usually sometimes it's just our press. So the local reporter might have a question about when do you think you're going to open your business or something of that nature. They're usually fairly laid back and not very stressful. Our board has a really good sense of humor, which we're fortunate for in Berlin. And so they try to make people feel as comfortable as they can when they come in and present to the board. And I just think that the more an applicant knows up front and the more homework that they've done by coming in and meeting with us as staff, the better they feel when they come in and stand in front of the board and pitch their project. And so it's really just about kind of understanding that there is a process in place. It's not meant to make it more difficult. It's just meant to give structure and framework to the community so that everyone's kind of given the same chance. It's fair and equitable. And we're doing what we can to make things as easy to understand as possible. And that's Berlin. So I'll pitch to Robin to give her experience for Lancaster.
So I want to stress that the timeline rules were amended in August of last year. So it's really fundamental that applicants who want to go before the planning board are prepared, because they only have 65 days from the date of accepting your application in order to make a decision. So if they need additional materials or just basically more information, it may end up being delayed longer than you anticipated. So the pre-planning meeting for Lancaster is really the opportunity to sit down with me. And I think one of the first slides says, know your board and know what you need to do. So typically I start out with giving you all the information you're going to need. I'll point out what's in the zoning ordinance. I'll give you the checklists so that you have them up front, and point out that if you need plans, that it is required to be in New Hampshire licensed engineered plans, so that you aren't getting blindsided in the end. And then once you get all of that, I'll even help. We can volley a narrative back and forth, because I know typically what a board or even what the statutes require for answers. So we can volley them back and forth until we get a narrative that fits the picture that you want to present to the board. Then the preliminary consultation with the board should, if you've gotten all of your ducks in a row, be a good opportunity to actually become comfortable with the board members, get to know them, pitch your project, and know kind of what they're expecting as you're moving forward. Because the first thing my board is going to do, and it's something that we just started doing, is they introduce themselves and tell you what the process is going to be once you get into a public hearing. So because I think that a lot of applicants feel that if a butters or anyone opposes your project, that it's automatically going to be a denial. And that's not necessarily so. the purpose here is to try to get to yes. So even if there is a no somewhere in this timeline, what are the different alternatives that we can explore so that we can get to yes? And then when you get to the public hearings, usually things are pretty streamlined if you've set up everything beforehand. And like Pam said, my board is laid back and has a very good sense of what the community wants. They are not only typically involved with just planning, but they're volunteers in a number of different civic organizations. So they have a broad knowledge of what is needed and what is wanted in the community. And even working on the master plan updates and committees. So they are the ones that are helping to collect the data from the community to create a structured plan for growth within the town.
And so if I was to add on to that, from a business perspective, when you're in your business plan stages, starting to flush out where you think you're going to go, this is where you would, in that preliminary consultation, that's the time to go to your planners and start speaking to them early on in that point. And as Pam and Robin both stressed, that stage is so crucial to make sure you get put on the right path. And so when you're trying to figure out your financing and capital stack and everything else, this will make sure you have a good idea going into your project of what's going to be needed. And also, as somebody who serves on Robin's planning board here in Lancaster, I can tell you from that perspective, we follow the checklists. There's concerted effort to make sure there are no biases, and we're just looking at the project from the project's sake without any other outside interference.
If I can, I'm going to add on to the train too on this one and say, it's really the idea behind, when I looked at this first slide, I thought, my goodness, were I not a planner, I would just think this looks like a list of meetings, right? And in reality, one thing to know about them is, like you're hearing everyone describe, the meetings are supposed to build on each other. And by the end of it, the idea is that when you get to the point where that's honestly for a business, maybe that most stressful part of permitting is being in front of the boards for those hearings. If you engage early and you step through these processes with the boards and with the staff in the town, it gets you to a place where those hearings should go smoothly, where there shouldn't be holes or delays or things like that. So I think there's a piece to know that the meetings, you might not always know exactly what is being decided at which one, right? That's the job of Robin's and Pam's and people like that to know what's happening in each of these meetings exactly. But for the business point of view, it's important to know that the earlier, the better, right? And you can engage, and as you keep engaging, it gets a little more formal as you go, but the staff is really there to be a resource for you. And so the other thing I wanted to sort of add on this slide is that at the end of the day, the planning board and the staff have sort of a duty to play, right? It's their duty to make sure that the town is developing in the way that lines up with the rules and the goals of the town. And the role of the staff, the duty of the staff is always to support both sides, right? To support the planning board, but then to also support you all as applicants in understanding that, because it can be complicated, right? And so the important piece is engage early and know that the people who are there are really there to fill their duty, right? To help you, help the board, and that make sure things are happening the way they should, more than say have like a popularity vote on your project. In the smallest towns, I think this is the last thing I'll say before we move to another slide, is that so in the towns that don't have a staff person, right? Lancaster and Berlin are super lucky to have Pam and Robin. And if you're working on a business in that town, you're lucky to have them too, right? As a voice to land on. Every town has that though. It might not be a staff person. It might be the chair of one of the boards, but there is always somebody to be that first point of contact. So if you're looking in a different town, you can call us down at the council to get connected with who's the planning board chair or where to sort of make contact in town hall. With Pam and Robin, it's a little bit easier because they're right there on the staff list, but every town, even the smallest ones with the littlest staff, do have somebody who's supposed to play these roles.
Yep, and you actually need, that's exactly what I was going to say. If you're not sure, you can reach out to both myself or Kayla, and we will get you going in the right direction.
So this next slide, I think we're going to do in sort of like a popcorn style. So what we did here is we came up with what are the common projects that come before planning boards or that y'all might be thinking about doing for your businesses. And what I think we were going to kind of hope to do here is do it a little bit popcorn style and just talk back and forth with Pam and Robin about what the process would be like for one of these types of projects. And what's interesting, what I'll say is these are written like planner projects, right? So from your point of view as the business, you might be like, I need more space for my parking lot. And we might look at that and say, that's going to be a lot line adjustment, right? That's where you're going to need a little more room on your lot and you're probably going to borrow it or buy it from a neighbor. And so these are kind of the ways that planners do that sorting of what you're trying to do in the real world versus how it's written in the town's documents that sort of direct it, right? The rules or the policies. And so like lot line adjustments, right? Those are things like you need a little more space. I'm going to just paraphrase these before we jump through them. This one that says no improvements, retail office space. That's like the example, one of the examples Pam brought up early of you're moving in and what was there before was pretty similar to you. Maybe you're selling disc golfs and the person before you was selling bobbleheads, who knows, right? But something. So it's just a similar use of the space. You're not really making big changes and you're kind of moving into a new space. Restaurants, cafes, and bars, those are simple, right? Those are the maybe new ones we're looking at in the towns. When we say building rehab / apartments, those would be things that are going to take more physical changes, right? So maybe in that second one, you're just moving into that space to sell your disc golf discs. But for the building rehab and apartments, you might be looking to sort of build something new, change what's happening there. The next one is new developments, right? Anything, Pam mentioned this a little earlier on, but a lot of times if you're putting up a new building or you're trying to do something totally new, you're probably going to hit some planning and zoning no matter where you are. So if we could, I want to just sort of spitball with you guys how what one of these would go forward in your towns, because they're all a little different, right? Towns do them all a little different. We all have to play by state statute. So there is a big rule book that nobody can sort of step too far wide from, but there's a flavor to it locally on how things are done. So
And I would encourage people to start writing in the chat if they have any particular questions or projects on mind that we could start addressing here as well.
yeah, that's a great call, right? Better than sort of the random ones. If you have a real one you want us to kick the tires on, we're happy to. So if you needed more space for that parking lot, Pam, Robin, if it was a lot line adjustment, so the property line between two things needs to be moved to make room for something to grow or come in. How does that sort of go in your towns? Robin, you want to kick that one off?
Sure. Well, a lot line adjustment is a subdivision. And I think there's a misconception generally that people look at, they hear the word subdivision and they think that it's maybe a housing development or something that's much bigger than that. But if you're just changing the lot lines, it's a subdivision and it's a technical subdivision. So you need a plan for it. The land has to be surveyed. And we have a checklist in our subdivision regulations that provide the background for that. So these are usually pretty cut and dry.
Very cut and dried.
Yeah.
And they are amongst the most simple of things that need to be done, but can be expensive depending on the survey needs and the amount of land that is being adjusted. I find that people do push back on this one a lot. Like, my neighbor's just giving me 10 feet and I'm giving them money. But we're required by law, because in order to register this, like any deed or easement, this gets registered with the registry of deeds. Legally, it's required that you have the property surveyed, even when you're doing something that seems very minor. And once that's established and someone actually understands the parameters, it goes very quickly and very fast because the surveyor really does the bulk of the work. And many times the applicants don't even come in, just the surveyor will come in and explain what's being done in our community. And that's kind of the extent of it. It goes rather quickly once that determination is made.
So yeah, those are probably the simplest, right? Our lot line adjustments, because those just go to the simple rules, right? How much land do you need in this area to do what you're doing? And assuming you're not breaking a rule about how much land you need and switching land between them, it's really the cost and the time comes in surveying, right? That's what's required for a subdivision. Even if it feels like a little move of that line, that's probably the piece that gets to be sort of the hardest to come by, or takes a little bit of work or resources from the business side. How about that move-in space, right? If you're moving your bobbleheads into the disc golf or the other way around, right? If you're taking a use and you're switching it, how would that go in each of your communities? Is that something that needs a permit? Does it go before a board? Is it done in-house? How do y'all look at those usually?
Well, if it's retail to retail, like you're saying, and it's allowed, then it doesn't actually need permission in terms of the zoning piece or to come before the planning board, because it's already at some point been permitted or taken care of, which does make it really easy, except for if you decide that you're going to make some big interior improvements, that might be structural, new windows, those kinds of things, then we direct you to code enforcement because you need some building permits. But otherwise, your involvement with planning and zoning is pretty minimal, other than to kind of have the conversation about what it is you want to do, and planning and zoning to make the determination that you either do need planning board input or you don't. But I mean, that's kind of easiest in our downtown district. I mean, for people moving into buildings that exist, they rarely find themselves coming to the planning board unless it's brand new construction or markedly different from what was being done there before.
I want to mention that that's all the same for Lancaster. However, I do feel that a building can't sit for 20 years and then have somebody come in and say, well, it was used as an office 20 years ago. In fact, it's usually around 3, because most of the case law determines that a use is abandoned after 3 years. So COVID actually created some issues with some of the properties because they either went out of business or they sat vacant, and 3 years went by pretty fast. So I think there's no hard rule on that, but I would bring in probably the fire department for just a routine inspection to make sure that it's move-in ready.
I can definitely speak to the scenario in Colebrook. There's the chamber decided to move its space, and just literally they needed to do some painting and woodwork in there, some changes, and in general they just needed an occupancy permit to be able to go in there. So to remember those pieces, and I know that's probably the same for Berlin and Lancaster as well.
So say we were taking that, maybe it's a pre-existing space and maybe it was used for retail before, right? But now say it's going to become a restaurant or a cafe or a bar. What does that particular type of development for you all add? Does it add other requirements about things? Does it change the way the permitting happens? What sort of comes together specifically for those pieces that are feeding people and gathering folks together like this?
Well, in Lancaster, there's just the change of use that would trigger a site plan. Whether that's a minor or major is probably, if you come to me on a pre-planning, I would tell you which direction to go into. There are other permits even outside of the town that changing to a restaurant or food services would trigger. And then Lancaster does not have a building inspector. However, the fire department can utilize some of the building code in their inspections, and I rely on them heavily when there's change of use like this. So they would have to go in, check for sprinkler requirements, hood requirements for the kitchen, grease traps, you know, it goes on and on. But this town would require a thorough fire inspection.
So similarly, we'd consider this a site plan as well that would come in front of the planning board, but I would normally take, if someone came into my office with their idea, an opportunity to direct them to code and fire first thing before they even came to the planning board. Especially if they haven't purchased the building yet, to do a walkthrough with code, because that can be where some of the big money comes in, like Robin just alluded to, in terms of if it was a space before that had maybe 10 people at a time and just retail and no food, and suddenly it's a space where there's like 40 or 50 people at a time, food, all the stuff that goes along with cooking, you likely need sprinklers if there were none there before. And that's a pretty big ticket item. So knowing kind of what you need starts really early. Like as soon as you have your idea, that's like matching you up with the right departments. And in our case, we do have a building inspector. We also have the fire department taking care of life safety codes, so we can get that out of the way before you even come to planning board, which is really a useful step. And then in the site plan, it's really about understanding how your business idea fits in with your environment, what kind of goes on around you. So if you're in downtown, that's usually a very good fit, because that's kind of where you might find other activities that are complementary, other restaurants, retail. If you're in a place where you're in a more quiet neighborhood, but maybe some, you know, this is a more general type of zone where this would be allowed, understanding like hours of operation, parking, lighting, you know, those kinds of things are usually the questions that might bring neighbors out to understand better what is happening. Because that's usually kind of the like, ooh, something very new here. This is different. We want to understand more. So really, like as early as you have your idea coming in and thinking about what you do or what you want to do, and us being able to match you up with the right staff or the right process is really important, especially if you're coming up with what seems to be a brand new or very different from what was happening in that existing space before.
I want to just add, it changes too when it's, for our downtown, most of the properties are mixed use. So if you wanted to convert one of the retail spaces into a restaurant, you can't look at the project in a bubble. So the site plan would probably be required, because you have residential units above it, which change all the requirements for building code and life safety and fire code. Having said that, I think I saw something pop up in the chat.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up once you guys got through your section as the first question. And so if you want to go ahead and address that, Robin, you're more than welcome to. So the question was, if you want to provide electric and water sources as at a site such as for food trucks, what's process?
That wasn't the one I was thinking of, but
okay.
we can do that under the other section or new development. Okay. But I just wanted to say that part of the site plan review would be review of how you are getting your utilities, whether it's electric, water, and sewer. So that all has to meet the criteria. There's even stormwater is thrown into there. And that's all part of the checklist. It's actually in a section of our checklist that is under the could be asked, required later, you know. So I usually just tell applicants, get what you can, get it all as much as you can up front.
And we do, and this would apply to both the restaurant, cafe, and bar, as well as some of these, the building rehab component, is CEDC has created a new grant called Professional Services. So if you are looking to need to do a study because you have to change the pipes because of asbestos, or run some other sort of report for environmental purposes on the building, because I know a lot of our mixed use buildings are older. We do have a grant now that specifically addresses that to help you get through that process.
So I think we're probably up to building rehab. So if you're making big changes to a building, it probably depends on the scale of the changes. I say that as a planner, but I'm curious sort of how does that process work? Does this trigger the full sort of vote for most of you all, where people are going in front of the planning board, or what comes to play when somebody's making sort of big changes to a building? Let's say changes to add a different use to it. Like here we have, it's written down as building rehab / apartments, right? Say you were going to put a couple of apartments in the building, or maybe they're already apartments and you're going to try and put your business in the first floor. And it's going to take some changes. How does sort of a bigger rehab project work through you guys as towns?
So we have a couple of examples in which, so there was an elementary school that closed 10 years ago that's now apartments and housing. And that came for site plan, mostly because obviously the use is different, for sure. And it wasn't so much about the living spaces themselves and the interior for the planning board, as much as it was making sure that the use fit in again with its surrounding environment. And, where was the parking going to be? Where was trash going to be stored outside? How would you deal with snow storage? Some things that were applicable maybe when it was a school, but some things that might be quite different. And so it was really a conversation about that, what's going on the exterior and around the building. And so usually, because it's such a big project, especially if you're doing several units at a time, you probably are already working with some professionals, such as maybe an architect or an engineer, and they are quite useful to the process as well, because they do these for many different clients. And so they have a good sense usually of a process around site plan and planning boards. And so they're usually just as much of a good support for you as our staff will be. And usually work with our staff quite closely to make sure that they are coming in with designs that make sense, that, follow code, that are gonna, be well accepted into the community. And they're not coming up with something that sticks out like a sore thumb, or it doesn't make sense for where, they're suggesting it. That's usually a process that is more involved and takes maybe a little bit more time just because of the effort around it. But nevertheless, same things apply, come in early, still understand what that checklist is that you have to follow and what you might need that might be unexpected or different, but really working with staff early and often, again, is just key to making this work.
Robin, any thoughts or additions from your side?
Well, as you had said, it really depends on the scope of the project. For Lancaster, our rules allow a minor site plan to be administratively decided. So I would probably consult with the town manager for change of use or for structural additions less than 1,200 square feet. So that kind of streamlines the process for some of these change of use types of things, so that they don't have to go through the site plan process, which is 2 meetings with the planning board. So one would be to accept their application, and the second would be to deliberate on the merits of the case. So if you could get it done through an administrative process, that helps.
Yeah, big time saver, huh?
Yes.
So I And now I'm looking at time and I want to make sure we have time for questions for people and where we are in our presentation. So I want to say new developments and other, maybe let's combine these two together and say, how would a new development is a new development going to take something different than that sort of bigger change we just talked about, or is it pretty similar? And then also let's try and grab that question about the utilities for food trucks, I think we were looking at.
Yeah, and I think in general, I think maybe, sort of that discussion on food trucks and where they fit in, and then obviously the electrical and water sources are the big component when it comes to something moving like that.
As Pam mentioned, a business always has to be aware of what its surroundings are. So with a food truck, if I had an empty lot somewhere and somebody wanted to create a little food truck area, that would likely require a site plan so that they could address everything from traffic flow to parking to utilities, etc. And well, I'm finished with that one. That it would require a site plan.
And if it was meant, we have licenses here locally for vendors. If it's something that like, they're coming to set up for a special event, or, they're here for just the summer or something, and they're self-contained, then you need just your license from the city clerk to do so. If it's something where you're thinking you want to set up permanently and you do want to connect to utilities and kind of make it as formal as you might if you were building a building, then it's likely a site plan with us as well.
If it's seasonal, you were saying?
If it's seasonal, we have a couple of very small repeat kind of individuals who come and set up in the summer months here, or just for special events, or like just for Fridays for a while. One vendor I can think of a few years ago. And it was just something that they came and they went. If it's something you're setting up like more permanent, especially if you want that like water and electricity available to you, then that's definitely more in line with if you were putting in, a small little building as well, but it's in the form of a truck. And, again, it's just about understanding, where that lot is and available utilities and whether that makes sense. I think that that's probably going to be the question, but there are places that like are already set up for electricity for special events that might be really easy for someone to kind of slide into, and this idea that it's short-term, seasonal, or something else, not permanent.
It's important to keep in mind how you're getting access to these as well.
Yes.
There's different permitting if it's off a state road or whether it's a town road.
Yeah.
And your planners can help walk you through that and be that resource. We don't expect you to be experts in this, and that's
right.
why we're here, or they're here. Looks like we had another question. Looking to make Sugar House and changing it into a restaurant a few years later. Can this be done on that's part of an association? Not sure I fully understand that question.
So if it's a lot like that's part of like an association in terms of like a condominium development kind of thing, so that they are part of an association, they probably have their own rules that you want to be aware of before you even start to come to talk to us. That's probably first and foremost. And then again, the idea, I don't know if the Sugar House is separate from the restaurant or it's a Sugar House that we're making into a restaurant, but nevertheless, Sugar House, I think, might come, and we have a couple of them here in the community that are just either very small operation that falls more under an agricultural kind of designation, in which they've been here before we even had any zoning, or someone who's kind of set one up in their backyard kind of thing. So it really just depends on the level of what it is you're seeking. And again, you'd know that best if you come in and talk with us, and we can kind of go through the checklist and understand what it is you want to do and what that might mean in terms of your possible needs for planning, zoning, or code. But a restaurant is usually, especially if you're changing something into a restaurant, is usually something that ends up with some form of permitting, be it a zoning thing, or even planning board, depending on the level of intensity of what it is that's being suggested.
Not only the association rules would dictate this, but your zoning district permissible uses.
Yes.
So, mention, just throwing out there, if you had a sugar house and you live out in the, you know, the back 40 of the town, so very rural part of town, is probably not a permissible use, and you'd have to go to zoning for a special exception.
So another question just popped up that I think I can jump in and answer, which is what are association rules? And basically, groups of homeowners, so either like a homeowners association or like a condominium association, can sometimes have their own rules about what you can and can't do on your property that are fully separate from town rules. And so that's what we're talking about here is, on one hand, you have the town rules, and on the other hand, you can have neighborhood rules that were put in place when that neighborhood came together. And sometimes those are, to be honest with you, sometimes they're a little stricter, to be honest, right? They might have different rules about whether or not you can have your boat in the front yard of your driveway. You know, they can be far more detailed than zoning. But to Robin's point, both have to be met. And I think the question about the sugar house had an answer in it itself I want to mention, which is that if you are looking at a business development that's going to take time to step up, right? I myself am a little bit of a small business owner, and I know sometimes you have the goal for 3 years from now and the goal for 6 years from now, right? So if the first goal is that sugar house, but then the second goal is a restaurant, what I would say is sort of a piece of advice when you are dealing with town hall permitting or city hall permitting is to be clear about what your end game is, even if you're not permitting for it right now, because if it's very important for you that that sugar house can become a restaurant in 5 years. But if you sit down today and we just talk about the sugar house, we might not advise you right on what might be needed for your long-term goal. So I think your question actually in the chat had an answer to it in it to itself, which is think about what your full vision is when you sit down and do those consultations so that you can know what might get in your way this year, but what also might get in your way when you take those bigger steps down the road too.
And it also might decide as far as equipment and things that you're purchasing, if it has to have a capacity to do those other things. That way you don't have to buy 2 separate pieces of equipment in that perspective. All right, I will move to the next.
So one piece we've talked about here, and we've done it back and forth, but that's the way all things good things come out in conversation, I think, is that there's different types of permitting needed, and there's different permitting that comes at different levels, right? We most recently just talked about your neighborhood rules versus your town rules, but then, and I'm sure this is probably not news for most, there's state rules that come into play. And so what we have here is a list of some of the other types of permitting and rules that might not come from the local town or city, but are probably can be applied to your project, right? And so those ones, driveway permits, right, sometimes are handled by states, sometimes local. Wastewater communities sometimes have their own wastewater standards, but most of the time it's the state permits you're working for on that. And locally, they're just trying to make sure you've got the right ones in hand. Alteration of terrain is another state permit that is applicable when you're making changes to the physical land, come into play quite a bit. Historic, right? When you're moving into or making changes to an old building, there actually might be pieces that come from that. And then this site phase 1 is like an environmental assessment of what might be on a property that you're looking to invest in. And so I think what we were going to sort of do here is talk a little bit about how that interplay between state and local works in the communities. What, to Pam and Robin, what of these topics do you have a hand in? Which ones are done wholly by the state? How do you sort of do that interface between state permits and then the local hearings that are happening?
So we have one tomorrow night, actually, that is a subdivision of land. That's also in the process of receiving its alteration of terrain permit. and the need because of the way they're dividing the land. It happens to be in a part of the city that's not served at the moment by wastewater. So in order to get a septic permit, you need a permit from New Hampshire DES, which is also where you get this permit for alteration of terrain, which means you've cleared or leveled or intend to remove a lot of trees and move a lot of earth to lay down a clean, clear site to bring in a new building or some purpose in which you'd need a large cleared area of land. So in working this out tomorrow night, in which it's a very simple subdivision in that it's one piece of land being split into two. And normally we would have no issues just going ahead and giving that permission from the planning board. But tomorrow night, based on conversations we've had with the surveyor, applicant and DES, will make our approval contingent upon the approval that will come from the state and for the alteration of terrain, and then subsequently the permit that they need for the septic. And so it's a situation where it's just a combination of understanding upfront which department needs what and which department kind of trumps what. And in this case, it's, you know, DES at the state level getting the final say. So the planning board, you know, they don't want to step in the way of our process. So we'll go through it. We'll still hear the application, and the board will likely render a decision, but they'll just make it contingent upon that favorable, positive decision that comes from the state when they're done their work. And so for the applicant, it's really a process of just, you know, waiting for those approvals to kind of slide in the order that they're supposed to come. But it's also one in which everyone usually knows upfront going in to like tomorrow night's meeting. It's not going to be a shocker or surprise to the applicant that they have to wait. The surveyor is the one that figured it out. And so just through communication upfront, we'll all go into this tomorrow night with an understanding of what needs to be done.
On Wednesday night for Lancaster, we have a public hearing for a solar generation facility. So they basically have to engage in every one of these permits. And just, I know the alteration of terrain has taken months for them, and we still don't have a report. So that is the most time consuming of these, as well as the historic archaeological cultural assessment that can really add some time before you even get before the planning board. So for me, I have a very collaborative relationship with New Hampshire DOT. I copy them on everything that we do that would impact a state road. So, and that's the moment somebody comes to me, so that we know, I get a response from them and I know exactly what they're going to want by the time they get before the planning board. Same thing with wastewater. Typically that deals with septic rules and what is the capacity of your septic system, and is the design approved. Most of us planners, I think, are automatically get the distribution from DES when there's a septic approval of their design and operation. So I try to work with everybody at the time that an applicant comes in to me and I know what's going to be going on, or at least I have an application in hand, because I don't want to do something before there's actually an active application, and it gets addressed from the beginning.
So the state permits come up, they always will, right? And in reality, the sort of same logic prevails, right? People like Robin and Pam can help you see where a state permit might be in place you might not be thinking about, but it's important to know that all those will come along at certain pieces.
Floodplain mitigation is something too that is really important. I didn't see it listed here, but there's a lot of properties here in town that are river level or below, so that needs to be addressed.
And usually you can find a way to have all of these things come together at the same time, right? And to some of the points that are being made, the planning boards usually want to know that you are pursuing your state permits. They
Right.
want to know that you're going to get the right state permits, right? And so they can help you see where they are, but they're not going to be the deciders on these ones for you, right? But they can help you see where you might need an outside yes or no, and then they can make sure that, usually one thing I see sometimes in planning boards is they want to make sure that what they have given you approval to do matches what the state agencies give you permission for too, right? So that everything lines up. And that's really sort of the duty of the planning board on those state permits, is to make sure that what they're permitting is going to line up with what's happening at the state level.
And again, going back to that preliminary consultation with your planner to make sure that you could get a really good sense of what your project timeline probably is going to be by taking advantage of that fully, so that you don't go into crisis mode because you thought you were going to be open in a month. And so we know that this is something that has to be thought of in a holistic approach for the entire community. And that's why we do go through these processes, because we know there can be other indirect impacts that we try to think ahead for the betterment of all.
So another piece that overlaps with planning a lot is, when do you need to bring in that expert? When do you need to bring in that engineer, right? What is needed that takes engineering sometimes? Because engineering, for the business side of things, when I hear engineering, I hear I'm going to have to pay somebody, right? And so these are some of the things that you might have to pay somebody to help you put together, to have plans that meet that standard of, we know they're accurate, we know that there's somebody's professional certification telling us that septic and the drainage calculations are done by the people who know that science, right? And not by sort of me with a napkin. You don't want me doing it. And so these are some of the engineering permits that come up very, very often. Well, sorry, not engineering permits. Some of the engineering work that ends up getting tied to some of the permits you might need. So you might need engineering to be done around traffic and parking. It is a strange thing when you are not often in planning to know that there are guidebooks and rules that tell you how many people go to an average coffee shop every hour at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. But there are these manuals that engineers use to help understand how many people come to a place, how many parking spaces they need, how much traffic that use will generate on a street. There's the same happens for lighting, of how much, if you're putting a lot of lighting up on a property, sometimes that lighting, it's important for it to stay on your property or not sort of be misdirected and shining in the wrong directions and in other people's windows. So they're actually lighting engineers who figure out how much light will be present, how far out from lights, to help a board understand if suddenly the stadium being proposed is going to make that neighborhood not so dark sky anymore, right? And similarly for septics, right? I think it's pretty common knowledge in 2023 that septic systems have to be engineered. We're not sort of back in the 70s when they could be a little more loosey-goosey. So you want to make sure those are based on engineering and solid science. And the same goes for drainage. So what I want to open it up to Robin and Pam for a bit is, when these engineering pieces come forward for you, how often do you guys end up having engineering that needs to be done in these categories? Because I know some towns that want lighting plans for everything. And I know some towns that would tell you, I don't even know what a lighting plan is to ask for it. So I'm curious on these sort of topics, right? Traffic, drainage, septic, lighting in your communities. When is that engineer needed? When does the checkbook need to come out for the expert for us to move forward?
It's usually for us with new construction is usually kind of the most obvious time in which engineers are needed for an applicant. And if it's a project in which that new construction is related to like a franchise or a developer who has experience in buildings in several different communities, they usually come with their own engineer. We don't even have to indicate that that's something that is an expectation because they're already on it. when you're a small business and you're doing something on a smaller scale, and I guess even if it is construction, I think that the point in which is usually for us, most applicants are coming into a property that already has the utilities. So septic is a rare one that ends up happening within the city. It's usually like making sure that your brand new parking lot and the drainage for that brand new parking lot is done in such a way that we're not suddenly dumping a ton more water into the city's streets or your neighbor's backyard kind of thing. We don't do lighting very often. That's a rare one for us, unless it's some business that's coming in with more than normal lighting requirements. And that's really been a rarity because we're also in a community that has a lot of streetlights, a lot of light pollution. So for someone to come in with extraordinary lighting requirements is not something that happens very often for us. But it's usually kind of related to that brand new construction or a really large undertaking in terms of a rehab, like turning a school into a housing of 10 apartments kind of thing. That's usually the case. If you're coming in with a very small plan, you're working in an existing building, you're not making huge changes, that it's very rare that you find yourself with a need for an engineer.
Homes, new construction of homes goes through the building permit process and doesn't have to do the site plan. So all those types of requirements would just go through me as the land use coordinator. So ditto on what Pam said, new construction is when these really come into play. Septic and drainage are always required per our rules. Traffic and lighting, well, actually drainage too. Traffic, drainage and lighting, stormwater runoff, those are all subject to being required by the board. So they're not always required. But typically I advise my clients, depending on what they're planning on doing, to at least provide something rudimentary. And if if they're required to go on for an engineered plan, that's on the board.
Great. So that's the end of what we had sort of prepared in conversation, but Erica, I'm sure we want to open it up and let people ask questions, even though.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please unmute yourself and ask them. I haven't seen any more questions on the chat. Again, we just wanted to, remind you, take the time, meet with your planners, look at the checklists. I'm sure they're all on your community's websites to access ahead of time so that you can get a sense of what they're looking for. So any questions? Any other projects, potential projects? Nobody? Well, I guess you guys answered all their questions as you went along.
Great.
Well, again, we'd just like to thank our panelists today for joining us. This has been recorded so that it will be saved and put on our website if you want to come back to it. If you are not in one of those communities that has somebody specifically, please reach out to Kayla and I, and we'd be happy to get you going in the right direction. And again, hold on, it looks like we got one more. Maybe. Oh, thanks for everyone. So yeah, that's it. And thank you again for attending, and thank you again to Passumpsic Savings Bank for being our sponsor. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Hi, everyone.